At the party, she turned to me and said she didn't want to be married anymore and left with another man. Just like that. Amidst the loud music, the laughter of the guests and the clinking of glasses of sparkling wine, she left our wedding behind like someone leaving an old coat on a random chair. And she took with her not only the years of coexistence, but the dignity that I had left in the face of so many curious eyes. The worst part wasn't even seeing her holding hands with another man, smiling as if she was breaking free from a prison. The worst part was the silence between us, as if the love that once existed had been erased with a breath. No tears, no apologies. Just the sound of the lounge door closing behind them and the hole growing in the middle of my chest. People pretended not to see, but I saw every crossed look, every whisper between glasses and sideways glances. I should have screamed, made a fuss, gone after her and demanded explanations. But I stood there, still, motionless, with my eyes fixed on the void where she had been for so many years. The pain was so sharp that it cut through the air. I returned home alone that night, with a lump in my throat and my heart falling into 1,000 pieces. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the certainty that she had planned everything. That wasn't an impulse. It was premeditated. And I, the fool, was just the audience at the spectacle of my own humiliation. In the following days, silence was the soundtrack of my existence. The bed seemed colder, the coffee more bitter, and the mirror reflected a man I no longer recognized. I tried to understand where I went wrong. Whether it was the excessive work, the prolonged absences, the silent dinners or the nights when I preferred to sleep early rather than listen to your rants. I asked myself 1,000 times if love was over and I didn't realize it. But deep down, I knew, no matter how many flaws I had, nothing justified what she did. Nothing explained the cruelty of turning our backs like that, as if our home were just a removable set, ready to be abandoned at the first opportunity. She disappeared from my life as quickly as she destroyed everything. He blocked messages, ignored connections, even disappeared from social media. Not a word. While I picked up the pieces and tried to breathe, she lived with him as if nothing had happened. The first time I saw them together was by chance, weeks later. They were at a restaurant we used to frequent, sitting at our favorite table, sharing the same wine as we celebrated our first anniversary. She laughed, loose, free. The image of her touching his arm made me feel nauseous. This wasn't just treason, it was mockery. But the world has a peculiar way of collecting its debts. And destiny is sometimes a merciless scriptwriter. I didn't have to do anything. I just waited. I continued to live, albeit in pieces, learning to rebuild myself among the rubble. It was then that she came back. Knocking on the door of my house as if I had just forgotten something in the room. It was different. Thinner, more haggard, her eyes without the sparkle they used to be. He brought with him an apology that seemed rehearsed and an empty speech about longing, regret and confusion. He said it was a mistake, that he acted on impulse, that he regretted it as soon as he woke up next to him. But it was too late. What she didn't know, and perhaps never imagined, was what had happened in the last few weeks. Her world, which seemed perfect next to her new love, had fallen apart as brutally as she had destroyed ours. She found out the hard way that she wasn't unique. The same man who took her away from my life was the same man who left her without warning, without explanations, without a future. He abandoned her overnight, as if she were disposable. And not only that, the way it happened, the place, the moment, everything was so cruel that I wonder if the universe hadn't written this irony to redeem me, even partially. She discovered, without warning, that she had been betrayed too. Not like I was, publicly, but in an even more cutting way, alone, in an apartment that wasn't hers, with suitcases packed for a trip that never happened. He went back to his ex, a younger, successful woman who, ironically, hated cheating. Her betrayal was punished with her own coin. But the void she left in me had already been filled. I had changed. I was no longer the same hurt, confused man from that party. Something in me had died that night, but something had also been born. The day she tried to return, everything was different. The house was tidy, the lights were on, soft music filled the room. I received her with a calm, serene, almost indifferent look. She expected tears, maybe a hug, a fight, a chance. But all he received was silence and a smile that hid the gulf between us. As she spoke, I just watched. And when she finished, she just said, "Now you're the one who's too late." And I closed the door. But that wasn't where the story ended. The real twist was yet to come, and the way she was torn apart, was worthy of what she did to me. A karma calculated by destiny. The detail she never imagined. Something that changed the course of her life forever. And the most curious thing, is that the man for whom she abandoned everything, including me, had a much darker and more selfish reason for taking her that night. A reason that only she would discover too late. A truth you will never forget. And that perhaps explains the real reason behind the regret that brought her back. But this would only be revealed much later. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize betrayal. All the stories you hear are fiction, but they reflect a painful truth: betrayal destroys homes, breaks hearts and marks lives forever. Our goal is to show, through intense stories, the real consequences of selfish and thoughtless choices. Get ready. What you are about to hear is shocking, emotional and unforgettable. Good story. They met in a cafe at the end of a random afternoon, the kind where the sun seems to say goodbye more calmly than usual. It was a chance, unplanned meeting between two people who weren't looking for anything, but who carried within themselves an emptiness that you only realize when someone new arrives and fills it. His name was Daniel, architect, reserved, meticulous, accustomed to the precision of forms and the comfortable silence of solitude. Her name was Elena, a literature teacher, passionate about words, full of enthusiasm and broad gestures, as if she wanted to embrace the entire world whenever she spoke about something she loved. From the beginning, they were opposites that did not repel each other, but balanced each other. He listened to her with rare attention, she made him smile easily. There was something between them that needed no effort, a lightness that enveloped them without rushing, as if they were both tired of battles and could finally rest in each other. The relationship started slowly. With walks in the park on Sundays, midnight messages just to say, "good night," and afternoons in bookstores where Elena dragged him through the aisles, reading excerpts from old novels while Daniel pretended not to like it, but secretly memorized every line she recited. When they decided to live together, the apartment seemed too small for how much they liked each other. Every corner was planned by him with details thought out for her. The bookshelf gained special space, so that Elena's books were organized as she liked. The kitchen, lit by a huge window, was the scene of many pancake mornings with laughter and shared cups of coffee. Sometimes they danced without music, just because one movement led to another, and that was enough. Over time, their love became habit, in the best sense of the word. The routine was not a burden, but a refuge. And when the wedding came, no one was surprised. It seemed inevitable. Natural. The ceremony was simple but full of meaning. Close friends, the entire family there, and a speech by Elena that even brought tears from the waiters. She talked about how loving Daniel was like finding shelter after years in the storm, and how he made her feel like the world could be safe again. Daniel, in turn, said little. He was never good with words, but when he finished the sentence saying that she was the most alive part of his life, there was nothing left to say. The first year of marriage was marked by rare tranquility. They planned trips, calmly furnished the home, visited new restaurants, returned to old places. Everything was accompanied by small gestures of care. He always left notes scattered around with phrases from books she loved, and she made a point of listening to his ideas about new architectural projects, even without understanding much about the subject. However, over time, the smooth gears began to creak, almost imperceptibly. Elena began to get more and more involved in events at the school where she worked, social dinners, and out-of-hours pedagogical meetings. Daniel, on the other hand, immersed himself in projects that required absolute concentration, deliveries with short deadlines, and demanding clients. Meals together became sporadic, conversations more shallow, as if the essentials were being pushed under an emotional rug. There were no fights, there was no shouting. Only silence, which began to grow between them like a crack in an old wall. Still, there was affection. When Elena was sick, Daniel would prepare soup the way she liked it. When he returned late and exhausted, he would find the bed made with his pajamas folded and tea ready on the bedside table. But there was something about the way their eyes stopped searching. In messages that became practical reminders. In the touch that used to be spontaneous and now seemed calculated. Even so, Daniel believed it was just a phase. All couples went through this. Mature love, he thought, was like that, quieter, more solid, less explosive. Elena, on the other hand, missed the intensity. From the shiver down her spine when he looked at her, from the euphoria of waiting for him at the door like at the beginning. She silently felt a longing for something that was still there, but seemed increasingly distant. The routine consumed them at different times. She arrived late from school, he left early for meetings. They slept together, but rarely woke up at the same time. Trips were being postponed. First for financial reasons, then for tiredness, then for simple disinterest. In the closet, clothes folded away. In the bathroom, toothbrushes that no longer touched each other. And even so, there were days when Elena would lean her head on his shoulder on the couch, and he would hold her hand as if to say, "We're still here." But the moments became fewer. A gesture, a kiss, a touch, each carried more weight, as if they were attempts to light a flame with wet matches. Close friends understood, but didn't comment. Photos on social media still showed smiles, glasses toasting, hands clasped together. But only the two of them knew how slowly their love was slipping through their fingers. One afternoon, during lunch with friends, an innocent question about children left them both disconcerted. It wasn't that they didn't want to, but now the idea seemed distant, unrealistic. What was once certainty was now doubt. The conversation cooled down. Elena covered it up with a sip of wine. Daniel looked at his plate in silence. And time, mercilessly, followed its course, corroding what was once so immense. Still, it wasn't a crumbling marriage. It was a live, but wounded relationship. With layers of stories, complicity and memories that still supported the pillars of what they had built together. Daniel was still the man she loved, and Elena was still, for him, the woman he wanted to grow old with. But there were holes. And no one really knew how to fill them out. Maybe out of fear of starting over. Maybe because I don't know where to start. And then the invitation came. A mutual friend would celebrate his 40th birthday with a party in an old, renovated hall, reminiscent of the youthful nights they both lived. The kind of event that, years ago, the two would have enjoyed as teenagers in love. But now, it seemed more like a formality. Still, they decided to go. As a couple. It was important to show that they were still together, despite the cracks. That night, she wore the red dress he always praised. He put on the blue tie she had given him as a gift for their second wedding anniversary. They arrived hand in hand, smiling at people they knew, making jokes, taking photos. For a moment, it seemed like everything was fine. But just for a moment. The hall was full of memories. Friends for decades, old songs, lights that made them more beautiful than they felt inside. They danced one song, maybe two. They talked to everyone, laughed with a few. And at one point in the evening, while Daniel was talking to an old college friend, Elena walked away for a few minutes. When he returned, there was something in her eyes that he didn't recognize. It was as if he had made a decision. As if he had stopped hesitating. He didn't understand right away. And perhaps he would never have understood if she hadn't stood in front of him and said those words. Those damn words that would change everything. But that was yet to come. For now, it was just the dancing, the music, the wine. For now, what existed was the faint glow of a marriage that still survived. But something, at that exact moment, was already starting to crumble inside. A feeling difficult to name, a decision that was formed in silence, a path of no return being taken step by step, without him even realizing it. Because sometimes, the greatest abysses open in silence. And those who love too much are always the last to see it. The music was still vibrating off the walls when Elena let go of Daniel's hand for the last time that night. It was just another party, one more occasion among many others in which they were both present together, smiled at each other and returned home in the same car, but in silence. He didn't immediately realize that that simple, almost imperceptible gesture was a harbinger of what was to come. She looked the same, beautiful, sociable, laughing with her childhood friends, moving around the room with the lightness that had always characterized her. Daniel continued with his glass in his hand, exchanging short sentences with acquaintances, smiling with the serenity of someone who believes he is still part of something firm. But there was a distance. Not physics. It was something deeper. An emotional dislocation. A type of absence that settles in the eyes of someone who no longer wants to be there. And at that moment, the hand that she had released was already looking for another. In the distance, she observed a man talking to some guests. Tall, confident posture, a rehearsed kind of charm. Daniel had greeted him earlier, a brief, polite greeting, without any warning sign. But her eyes lingered a little longer than expected. He wasn't a stranger. He was someone who had been around for some time at the same parties, dinners and social circles they attended. Someone with whom he had exchanged smiles before, quick comments, jokes disguised as kindness. And that night, with Daniel distracted, she crossed the room and approached him like someone who knew exactly what she wanted. There was no hesitation, no embarrassment. They both knew what they were about to initiate, even without saying a word. The hours passed and Daniel, as always, was the first to get tired. He asked her if she wanted to leave. Elena smiled and said that she preferred to stay a little longer, that she was having fun, that they deserved a different night. He hesitated, but eventually agreed. He asked for a car, placed a kiss on her forehead and left. On the way home, he felt a slight discomfort in his stomach, a kind of emptiness that he couldn't explain. But he pushed the thoughts away. I was just tired. He got home, took a shower, went to bed, and fell asleep waiting for the sound of the key turning in the door, which never came that night. Elena remained in the hall for another hour and then left. She wasn't drunk, but she walked as if she were being carried away by a greater force. He got a ride with him. The man with whom he spent weeks exchanging hidden messages, disguised smiles, long looks. They went to a hotel in the center, a discreet, reserved place. The ride there was silent, except for some forced laughter. When they entered the room, she hesitated for a moment. He remembered Daniel. From your hands. The way he looked at her in the early years. But he didn't go back. The night went on as if the world outside didn't exist. And at that moment, Elena's marriage ceased to be a reality. It became a memory. The next day, she returned home early. Daniel had already left for work. The apartment was as always, organized, welcoming, with a note on the refrigerator saying that he had left coffee ready for her. Elena remained standing in front of the note for a few minutes, feeling the weight of what she had done for the first time. That wasn't a rant, nor a momentary failure. It was a choice. And in a way, she felt different. No better. Just different. As if a door had been opened inside her. I didn't know exactly where it led, but I had already crossed the threshold. In the following days, he tried to maintain his routine. The gestures, the words, the interactions with Daniel, everything followed the same rhythm as always. He didn't seem to suspect anything. He was still making plans, still talking about the trip he intended to take at the end of the year, still mentioning the possibility of starting to try to have children next fall. And with his every word, something in Elena tightened. It was as if she were watching a film where she no longer recognized herself as the protagonist. The messages with the other man continued. Now bolder. With more intensity. Quick meetings during lunch break, coffees in the middle of the afternoon, a touch of adrenaline that gave her back a version of herself that she believed had been forgotten. But there was also guilt. In the moments of silence, in the shower, when preparing dinner, in the moments when Daniel hugged her from behind and called her, "my love," in a whisper. The guilt was there. Like an invisible thread that squeezed his neck gently, but constantly. She tried to rationalize, telling herself that she needed to feel something new, that maybe the marriage had really cooled down, that Daniel, with all his silent dedication, no longer made her vibrate like before. But these justifications were never complete. Never enough. Because deep down, she knew there was still love. Maybe different, maybe deadened, but still alive. And for that reason, the pain was greater. Daniel, in turn, was focused on a new project. Something big. A cultural center with a sustainable concept, which kept him busy until late. He would come home exhausted, his eyes lit up with passion for his work, and he would tell Elena about the ideas he had, the team's challenges, the client's praise. And she listened to him, smiled, asked questions, made it seem like everything was the same. But it wasn't anymore. The distance between them increased with each night she spent out, with each message she received smiling alone, with each kiss she gave in a hurry to leave and not be late for another meeting. The imbalance intensified when he invited her out to dinner on a random Friday. I wanted something simple, but symbolic. Just the two of them. A rescue of what they were. Elena made up an excuse. She said she was overwhelmed, that she needed to rest. In fact, I had another commitment. Another room. Another bed. Daniel noticed something strange that night. A clearer distance, a subtle change in the tone of her voice, an impatience disguised as tiredness. He began to observe more. Analyze small details. The cell phone that was now never left on the table. Quick exits to reply to messages. The different clothes. The strongest perfume. Delays are becoming more and more frequent. But he didn't say anything. Not yet. He kept every sign to himself. And waited. Hope still held out, despite everything. I hoped she was just confused, going through some difficult phase, something they could work through together. But the truth was already walking alongside them and, soon, it would stop hiding. It was on a Saturday night that everything revealed itself. A dinner at a friend's house. They were all gathered together, talking, drinking wine, laughing about old stories. Daniel watched Elena from afar, more excited than usual. His eyes sparkled. And at one point, when she thought no one was looking, she took out her cell phone, typed something quickly and smiled. A smile he hadn't seen in a long time. A smile that wasn't meant for him. That was the snap. The final point. Daniel didn't say anything that night, but he decided he needed to confirm what he already intuited. And he did. Hired an investigator. Someone discreet, professional. And, within a few days, confirmation arrived. Photos. Locations. Dates. Schedules. Intercepted messages. It was real. Elena betrayed him. And she did it with a coldness that Daniel never imagined possible in her. The images devastated him. He felt small, unimportant, disposable. But most of all, he felt ridiculous for still loving her. He spent sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling, reviewing every moment, trying to understand when things started to fall apart. Trying to understand what I had done wrong. But there was no answer. Sometimes the mistake is not in the one you love. It is in those who no longer know how to receive this love. Still, he didn't confront her right away. I wanted to observe. See how far she would go. The next invitation he received was to a party. Birthday of a childhood friend of hers. Elena insisted that they go together. And Daniel accepted. Something inside him needed to see. I needed to face it. That night, she looked stunning. More than ever. He talked to everyone, smiled, enchanted. And, at a certain point, he realized when the man arrived. It wasn't the first time I'd seen him. But now, it all made sense. The looks. Body language. The disguised tension. And then, in the middle of the room, she turned to Daniel with a look that mixed firmness and lightness. She said, with terrifying calm, that she no longer wanted to be married. And before he said anything, she turned her back and left. With him. The pain came like a punch to the stomach. The surrounding noise became muted. The faces blurred. Everything seemed slow, distorted. Daniel stood there, still, with the cup still in his hand and his heart shattered in his chest. But what Elena didn't know, and couldn't even imagine, was that destiny had much crueler plans in store for her. And that the night he believed he was freeing himself would only be the beginning of something much bigger. Something she would never forget. The call came on a gray Wednesday morning, one of those mornings that start to feel heavy before you even get out of bed. Elena didn't expect to hear that voice again, much less with that tone. The man for whom he had abandoned everything, the same man with whom he had walked out the door of the hall days before without even looking back, now spoke coldly, with an impersonal rush that cut more than any silence. He said they needed to talk, that there was something he couldn't postpone any longer. She insisted that they speak on the phone, but he was direct, it needs to be in person. Today. Now. She hesitated for a few seconds, but the way he said the words made her stomach turn. Something was out of place. Something she couldn't decipher. They met in his apartment, a small, disorganized loft, different from the environment in which she was used to living. For the first time, Elena noticed the unpainted walls, the raw light, the clothes thrown on chairs. It was as if the space carried the same emptiness that she was beginning to feel inside. He was sitting at the table, with his cell phone in his hand, eyes downcast, fingers restless. When she entered, he didn't smile. I didn't say a word. He just pointed to the chair in front. She sat in silence, feeling her heart racing without knowing exactly why. He took a deep breath, rubbed his face hard and began to speak with an honesty that went through her like a knife. He said he wasn't good with feelings, that he never promised anything, that from the beginning everything had been clear to him, it was lightness, it was escape, it was impulse. But Elena, on the contrary, started to believe in the future, started talking about plans, started wanting more. And he wasn't there for that. I like you, he said, but not in the way you think. And there's another thing. I'm back with my ex. Elena stood still. It didn't blink. The words echoed in his mind as if they had nowhere to land. She got up slowly, like someone who doesn't accept being pushed out of a reality she chose, and asked if it was serious. He just shook his head. She found out about everything. She gave me one last chance. I accepted. And then, with the coolness of someone who is just wrapping up a work meeting, he added, I think it's best if you don't look for me anymore. She left there stunned. The noise of traffic seemed distant, muffled, as if it were underwater. He walked aimlessly for almost an hour, trying to organize his thoughts, trying to understand how everything was falling apart so quickly. How could you trust someone so much who, now, couldn't even look you in the eye? But the worst was yet to come, and she couldn't even imagine it. The next day, when he opened the email from the school where he taught, he came across a message from the General Coordination. An internal statement informed about the suspension of its activities, alleging inappropriate conduct involving members of the school community. The hand started to shake. She didn't understand. When he clicked on the attachment, the ground beneath his feet simply disappeared. Photos. Prints of conversations. Security cameras. Images of her and the man entering and leaving the school at suspicious times. Records of calls made during working hours. Students had commented. Parents made complaints. And now, everything was formalized. The scandal took shape, body, a life of its own. And her name was the title. The impact was immediate. He had to hand in his badge, empty his desk under silent gazes, face colleagues who turned away. He left through the back door of the school where he had dedicated almost a decade of his life, without goodbyes, without dignity. The shame was more cutting than the pain of loss. She walked through the streets trying to hide her face, as if the entire city knew what she had done. And maybe they knew. The news spread faster than she imagined. Parent groups, social media, even an article on a local blog speculating about the teacher who destroyed a home and lost everything. Over time, she stopped receiving messages. The friends, one by one, disappeared. The invitations decreased until they disappeared. The apartment he shared with the man became an empty space, and then inaccessible. He had changed the locks. His clothes were delivered in bags, left at the entrance of a building that no longer belonged to him. There was nowhere to go back. The family, embarrassed, preferred to keep their distance. Not because of a lack of love, but because of fear of judgment. It was in this state, at the bottom of the abyss, that she decided to look for Daniel. Without many words, he just appeared in front of the old house. The same building, the same door, the same key that no longer belonged to her. He knocked hesitantly, expecting maybe a scream, maybe a door slammed in his face, maybe nothing. But he opened it. And what he saw was not the man he had left weeks ago. Daniel was different. More upright, more centered, with a firmer gaze. There was no anger in his eyes. There was something else. Something more difficult to face, detachment. She tried to smile, but her eyes betrayed desperation. She said she needed to talk, that she was sorry, that she had made a mistake, that everything had gotten out of control. Daniel listened to her in silence, with his arms crossed. He allowed her to speak, to cry, to explain, to apologize. And then, calmly, he replied that there was no longer room for that. That the love he felt for her was no longer enough to allow his presence there. But there was more. There was something he needed to tell. And that was what he had kept since the beginning of the night she left. Daniel led her to the living room, asked her to sit down, and went to the bedroom. He returned with a box in hand. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside, there were documents, a pen drive, some printed photos. He said he didn't just hire an investigator to find out who she was with. He had investigated the other man as well. Because something, from the beginning, didn't feel right. And what he discovered made all the pain turn into fury. That man, the same one Elena exchanged a marriage for, wasn't just an occasional seducer. He was, in fact, a man who, years ago, had been accused by an ex-partner of emotional manipulation and sentimental fraud. The process had not continued due to lack of evidence, but the history was known to anyone who knew how to look. And Daniel searched. But the worst came later. When investigating the man's ties, Daniel discovered that he had returned with his ex-wife weeks before approaching Elena. And not only that, there were records of strange financial transactions, messages retrieved from applications with dates that proved that it had been used since the beginning. The affair with Elena was nothing more than a provocation, a personal revenge by the man against someone from the past. His ex-wife, upon finding out about the relationship, demanded that he end it immediately and return home. And he obeyed, handing Elena over as an object that no longer had any value. Daniel showed the evidence. Every detail. Every fact. There was no denying it. Elena was silent. Hands on knees, eyes empty, mouth half open as if trying to breathe underwater. She didn't cry. He didn't have the strength. He just whispered that he didn't know. That I had no idea. And it all seemed like a lie. But it was real. And crueler than anything she could have imagined. Daniel then stood up and said that this was the last conversation between them. Not with hate. But with the peace of someone who no longer feels anything. She said that his love had died the night she turned her back, and that what was left now was just the certainty that he would never allow anyone to break him like that again. And with that, he said goodbye. Elena didn't respond. He left the house in silence, without direction, without ground, without present and without future. And what she also didn't know, yet, was that that wasn't the end of her fall. It was just the beginning. Because destiny, once again, awaited her with another bitter surprise. That night, after the door closed behind her, Elena had nowhere to go. There was no longer her old apartment, nor reliable friends, nor even the courage to face her own parents, who, since the scandal at school, had limited themselves to short, cold responses when she tried to contact her. She walked for hours aimlessly, passing streets that once seemed familiar but now seemed to look at her with contempt. Her eyes burned, but she no longer cried. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain was so great that tears seemed useless. He stopped in front of a cheap hotel, one of those that he avoided out of prejudice, and, with the last raise he had, he got a small room, with a musty smell and sheets that looked like they hadn't seen soap in weeks. She threw herself on the bed fully clothed, without hunger, without sleep, without the desire to continue breathing. The fall, until then emotional, now became physical. I felt in my body the weight of wrong decisions, of avoided looks, of shame stuck to my skin like dust that was impossible to remove. 2 days passed before she had the courage to leave. On the third morning, he woke up to a notification on his cell phone. It was a message from the school coordinator, who, despite the suspension, still maintained some ties with her. The message was short but revealing. You might want to know that that man, the one who was involved with you, was seen yesterday with a new teacher. They said he's from the municipal network. Be careful. Elena read and reread the message in disbelief. Not because of the content, but because of the irony. Was there still something to lose? Apparently yes. This was no longer about Daniel, nor about scandal. It was about the definitive realization that she had just been a game, a disposable piece on a much bigger board. With shaking hands, he accessed social media. He discovered the profile of that teacher. Young, beautiful, newly arrived in the city. In the photos, there he was, the same man who had promised the world to Elena, now hugging the other, smiling with the same rehearsed intensity. Comments said they were living a new phase, a love that overcame barriers, and she almost laughed. The sarcasm was too cruel even for her. He turned off his cell phone and stared at the ceiling of his room, trying to understand how his life had fallen apart so quickly. Marriage, work, prestige, dignity, everything had slipped through his fingers. And yet, the world went on. The city didn't stop. People didn't change their route to work, they didn't stop eating breakfast. Elena's tragedy was hers alone. The universe, relentless, offered no respite to anyone. At the end of the week, Elena decided she needed to talk to Daniel one more time. Not to beg, not to try to get back together. But to ask for forgiveness. A real, human, raw forgiveness. Called. He didn't answer. He sent a short message, I need to see you. Just once. Please. Hours later, he responded with a sentence that sounded like a punch, tomorrow, at 6 p.m. Praca das Acacias. It was a symbolic place, where they used to walk on Sunday afternoons, before time started to erase what they were. She spent the day rehearsing what she would say. He couldn't concentrate on beautiful sentences. I just wanted to tell the truth. I wanted to look into his eyes and recognize everything he had destroyed. It arrived on time. Daniel was already waiting for her, sitting on a bench under an old tree, with his hands clasped in his lap. He wore a light, simple shirt and seemed calm. But there was something in his gaze that Elena didn't recognize. A type of serenity that didn't match the chaos he felt inside. She sat down next to him, keeping a respectful distance. For a few seconds, they were silent. Only the sound of leaves moving in the wind and children playing in the distance filled the space between them. She began to speak with difficulty. She said there were no excuses, that she had lost herself, that she had let herself be carried away by an illusion. He told about the dismissal, the scandal, the abandonment. He admitted that he no longer had anywhere to live, nowhere to work, or anyone to call. Daniel listened to everything in silence, without interrupting. He just watched, with a firm gaze, like someone watching someone take off all their masks. When she finished, she lowered her eyes, as if ashamed of her own existence. Daniel took a deep breath before responding. He said he wanted her to find the strength to rebuild herself. That the pain she felt now was perhaps necessary to see what he had already seen a long time ago. But then, looking away to some point ahead, he added in an unexpectedly mild tone, "And I also need to tell you something." Elena looked up in surprise. "I didn't expect anything from him." He thought he already knew everything, that there were no more surprises between them. Daniel then revealed that, days after the separation, he had been approached by a woman, the ex of the man Elena was involved with. The woman wanted to understand what had happened, how everything intersected, and, in a sincere and surprisingly painful conversation, the two ended up discovering that they had been victims of the same story. But the most devastating thing was what this woman revealed to Daniel during that conversation. The man, the same one who seduced Elena, had made a bet with longtime friends. Bet recorded in messages, in audios, everything saved, everything archived, where he said he would be able to destroy a stable marriage with just words, just charm. The woman, indignant, shared everything with Daniel. And he, in turn, had gathered it all together as part of the dossier he showed Elena on her last visit. But on that occasion, he had omitted this detail. Not out of pity, but knowing she wasn't yet ready to know how deeply she had been used. Elena froze. The words echoed inside her with absurd force. It was more than betrayal. More than abandonment. It was dehumanization. She had been part of an experiment, a cruel game fueled by vanity and sadism. I couldn't react. There were no tears. There was no voice. Just the muffled sound of your own breathing trying to find a rhythm. Daniel then got up, adjusted his shirt sleeve and, with one last look, said that he wanted her to find herself again. That he didn't expect anything more from her. Neither love nor forgiveness. But that, if one day I were someone I could trust again, I could look back on the past with less pain. He turned and walked towards the car, without rushing, without drama. Elena remained on the bench, motionless, with her hands shaking and her eyes fixed on the floor. That night, upon returning to the hotel, she sat in front of the mirror and looked at her own face for long minutes. She was an unrecognizable woman. Scarred, tired, broken. But something inside her, something small, almost imperceptible, seemed to awaken. A tiny spark of shame converted into desire. Not to win Daniel back, not to clean up his image in front of others. But to, for the first time in a long time, stop destroying yourself. And it was like that, in the silence of the early morning, within the walls of a room rented for a few coins, that Elena made the decision to disappear. Not as an escape, but as a restart. He cut his hair, sold what little he had, took a bus to another city. A city where no one knew its name, its history, its mistakes. Started over from scratch. He worked as a clerk in a small bookstore. He didn't talk about the past. He didn't look for new loves. She just lived, discreetly, in silence, trying to reconnect with the woman she once was. Meanwhile, Daniel went on with his life. Little by little, the wound left by betrayal gave way to reconstruction. He met new people, dedicated himself even more to work, met old friends. And, on a rainy afternoon, while sheltering under the awning of a cafe, he met Laura. A calm woman, with steady eyes and slow words. Someone who did not fill the void left by Elena, but who built, alongside it, a new space, without rushing, without urgency. And, perhaps, that was what he needed all along, someone who knew how to stay, not because of a lack of options, but because of a genuine choice. Time passed. And the past, although never completely erased, began to take up less space. But in some corner of the world, Elena still wondered, night after night, at what point she had lost her way. Because there are mistakes that life charges with interest. And there are decisions that make an impact, not only because of the pain they cause, but because of the certainty that there is no going back. Never again. Elena's life, since her definitive departure, was filled with a silence that was not an absence, but a reconstruction. He moved to a place where the streets were new, the faces were unfamiliar and the names carried no stories. She found shelter in a modest guest house at the top of a hill where the cell phone signal frequently failed, something that, for many, would be a nuisance, but for her it became a relief. In that simple setting, without luxuries, surrounded by the sounds of nature and the constant smell of coffee being brewed in the common kitchen, she began the process she feared most, facing herself without filters, without noise, without distractions. Work at the bookstore was monotonous but stable. She arranged shelves, organized stocks, indicated books that she herself still couldn't read without the words going through her like blades. Each story that passed through his hands seemed to carry reflections of what he experienced. Betrayals, losses, new beginnings. But it was in this repeated routine that she began to recognize herself. Not with pride. Not with joy. But with a strange peace that only comes when you have nowhere else to run. Daniel, on the other hand, experienced another type of silence. His reconstruction took place amidst the movement. His career advanced, projects gained prominence, awards began to come. But it was in his relationship with Laura that he experienced the lightness he always wanted. She didn't make him forget the past, but she made him no longer depend on it. Laura was unlike anything he had ever known. There was a calm maturity about her, an absence of rush, a presence that required no explanation. And Daniel, for the first time in a long time, allowed himself to trust. Still with caution, still with limits, but with sincerity. And this confidence grew day after day, like a plant that adapts to the shade until it finds the light. Over time, the dinners became more frequent, the conversations deeper, and when she invited him to meet her parents, he understood that he was crossing an invisible frontier, that of believing in love again. Meanwhile, Elena faced a dilemma that was silently growing inside her. Contact with the ex of the man who had used her as a pawn in a cruel game, which was previously a distant memory, came back to the surface when, one afternoon, when she opened her old email box, a box she had avoided for months, she came across an unread message. It was hers. A letter. No anger, no accusations, just a raw account of how this man had destroyed other lives before, how he repeated patterns, how he used vulnerabilities as tools. The message did not seek justice or empathy. It was, above all, a warning. The final line read, "I hope one day you understand that what you did to Daniel was horrible, but what he did to you was inhumane. What sets us apart is what we do with it." Elena read that sentence more than 20 times. And there was a spark of a thought that repelled her and, at the same time, drove her. Maybe she should tell him. Expose. Show the world the truth about that man. Not as revenge, but as a warning. But at the same time, I feared appearing to be seeking redemption. He was afraid that his voice was no longer valid. What could someone like her still say that would be taken seriously? For weeks, she fueled this internal conflict. She felt tempted to take a step forward, to seek a minimal reparation for all the chaos. But every time she considered speaking out, a part of her whispered that it was too late, that silence might be her only penance. And then, in the midst of this indecision, an unexpected invitation appeared. The bookstore would organize a small literary fair and needed volunteers to assist the guest authors, take care of the presentations and facilitate conversation circles. Elena hesitantly accepted. Not because of the event itself, but because I saw a chance to do something different, even if small. On opening night, I was nervous but calm. She wore simple clothes, hair tied up, light makeup. It was a new version of herself, more contained, less vibrant, but more authentic. Among the invited authors, a renowned journalist would present a book about psychological violence and abusive relationships. During the lecture, the woman reported real cases, stories of women who had been manipulated, isolated, used. In one of the excerpts, he mentioned a series of anonymous complaints that, years before, had been archived due to lack of evidence, but which were now being reopened after new testimonies emerged. The man's name was never mentioned. But Elena knew. He knew exactly who was being talked about. He felt his blood run cold, his hands sweat, his throat close. For the first time, he saw that there was a real, concrete movement happening. And there, sitting among strangers, I knew what I needed to do. At the end of the event, he approached the journalist. He asked for a minute. Identified himself. He told his story. He didn't hide. He admitted his mistakes, his guilt, his choices. But it also revealed what I had experienced, what I had discovered, what I had felt. Not as a victim, but as someone who decided to no longer remain silent. The journalist listened to everything in silence, eyes fixed, posture attentive. When Elena finished, she heard a "thank you" that sounded more like release than gratitude. "You left your contact details." He handed over the files that Daniel had given him. And he left, without expecting a return. Weeks later, he received a call. The case would be published. Names preserved, for now, but the structure of the manipulation would be exposed. And, if necessary, she would be invited to testify in a new investigation. Elena didn't tremble. He didn't hesitate. I was ready. Not for justice, but for responsibility. Not for applause, but for confrontation. It was his silent way of saying, I will not allow others to go through what I went through. Meanwhile, Daniel went on with his life. The new relationship with Laura progressed at its own, but solid, pace. He didn't know about Elena's last steps. I didn't try to find out. But something inside him, perhaps out of intuition, perhaps out of relief, felt that the story was finally finding closure. Until, one spring afternoon, while drinking coffee at a downtown bakery, he received a notification on his cell phone. An article. Shared by an acquaintance at the office. The title was straightforward, "The Silence of Victims is Not Forgetting." And in content, the anonymous narrative of a woman who had been deceived by a charismatic man, who had abandoned everything for him and paid a devastating price for it. Daniel knew right away. It was her. He read each line carefully, not with resentment, but with a strange mixture of sadness and respect. He felt no pleasure in seeing her expose herself. But I didn't feel sorry either. I felt recognition. She was finally accepting the pain she caused, and more than that, she was transforming her shame into something that could have some purpose. He smiled lightly. He took a deep breath. And he paid the bill with the serenity of someone who knows that, sometimes, time doesn't erase everything, but it teaches us to live with the scars. Night fell. Elena walked alone down the main street of the small town she now called home. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid of being seen, didn't feel the need to hide. I knew I still carried many mistakes, many ghosts. But I also knew I was building something new. Still imperfect, still fragile, but real. And that, for her, was more than enough. What would come next, she still didn't know. But now, at least, she was ready to receive. Because the pain doesn't go away. But it can, little by little, give way to consciousness. And it is conscience, not forgiveness, that sustains a dignified life after chaos. The article that exposed that man's pattern of manipulation and emotional abuse had a repercussion that no one expected. Within days, women from different places began reporting similar stories. Some with silent endings, others with devastating consequences. What once seemed like an isolated case turned out to be a repeated and cruel cycle, sustained by omissions and silence. The publication gained space in larger outlets, was replicated by respected columnists, and soon became the subject of public debates about toxic relationships and veiled psychological abuse. The figure behind those stories, until then charismatic and well-connected, lost space, lost contracts, lost reputation. He tried to defend himself, he alleged a frame-up, persecution, but the facts were too many, the testimonies were too detailed. The case that had previously been archived was reopened with new evidence, and he was summoned to testify. Now it was a tarnished name, involved in a web that he himself built, and where no justification was enough. Those who supported him began to move away, those who admired him fell silent. And when he, alone in a cold police station room, had to hear the formal accusations from a prosecutor, he understood that for the first time he had no control over the game. Elena found out about the repercussions through the networks. He did not seek details. All he had to do was know that the truth was finally finding its way. There was no pleasure, there was no euphoria. Just the certainty that, even in the midst of darkness, it was possible to turn on a small light. He continued with his work at the bookstore, but now he began to receive different looks. Looks of respect, of curiosity, of those who recognized something in her other than the woman who had fallen. She began to be invited to speak at small meetings, support groups, and community fairs. He told his story without flourishes, without emotional makeup, without victimizing himself. It counted as someone who fell and chose to get up without stepping on anyone. It was on this path, taken step by step, that he found meaning again. I wasn't looking for applause. But finally I felt like I could be useful. Time, which previously seemed like your enemy, became your ally. His nights became less long, his silences less heavy. He learned to take care of himself without rushing. He regained the desire to read. He started writing again. She taught herself that guilt did not need to be eternal, but rather pedagogical. She learned to see herself more generously, without forgetting what she did, but also without letting it define who she was. And it was exactly along this path of reconstruction that, on a random afternoon, among books and anonymous people, he met someone new. A simple man, with calm speech, a sincere smile, who knew nothing about his past. He met her there, the way she was now, not the way she was. And, without realizing it, Elena allowed herself, little by little, to make room for the unexpected. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something rarer, interest without anxiety, presence without demands, company without fear. A new beginning that did not seek to repair the past, but simply to exist. Daniel, in turn, saw his life take a shape he had never predicted. The relationship with Laura matured over time, without the pain of the past. She didn't need to patch up old wounds because he had already done that work himself before meeting her. They lived lightly, but deeply. She respected his silence, admired his convictions, and he learned to share without fear, to trust without distrust. When, a year later, they decided to move in together, there was no party, no grand announcement. It was a peaceful decision, like everything between them. And it was in this new home, with windows open to the morning sun and plants everywhere, that Daniel experienced something he thought he had lost forever, peace. Elena's presence in his memory has not disappeared. But it transformed. It stopped being pain, it stopped being disappointment. It became a learning experience. A closed chapter, but one that helped me write the following ones with more awareness. He never tried to find out what happened to her again. But I discovered, by chance, when I read an article written by an NGO that supports emotional victims, that she had become one of the strongest voices on the subject. He saw a small photo in the bottom corner of the text. She smiled with calm eyes, like someone who walked through a fire and learned to breathe again. And he smiled too. Not with longing, but with respect. As for the man who caused it all, his fall was silent but relentless. The social distancing, the end of contracts, the accumulated lawsuits, everything turned into a spiral that he could no longer control. He tried to reinvent himself, change cities, return with a different name. But his reputation preceded him. The faces changed, the environments too, but the truth always found him. He ended up alone, wrapped up in conspiracy theories that no one took seriously anymore. His arrogance prevented him from apologizing, his vanity prevented him from starting over. And when, finally, he looked around and saw that there was no one left, he understood that the only person he didn't know how to manipulate was himself. The story finally found its conclusion. Each one paid or reaped what they sowed. Love, even broken, found new ways of existing. The pain, even unbearable, taught. And the truth, even delayed, came. Because life, no matter how cruel it is, has a silent way of restoring balance. Now tell me, what did you think of this story? Would you have done differently in the character's shoes? Leave your comment, your opinion is important to us. And if this story has stuck with you so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every week we have new real, exciting and impactful stories like this. Always remembering, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Here, we show the real consequences of thoughtless choices. Because the truth hurts, but it teaches. Until next time.